We got company.
Broadsword calling Danny Boy.
You have my sympathies.
We do not follow maps to buried treasure, and X never, ever marks the spot.
I'm glad it's you.
Well, I understand double O's have a very short life expectancy, so your mistake will be short-lived.
Would you like some refreshments?
Oh, I'm fine. Thank
Enjoy the show.
Hi there, welcome to Sitting Through the Credits, a film review podcast covering new releases, cult classics, and everything in between. My name is Matt, and for this 7th episode I'll be covering another cult 1970s classic, the 1972 film Horror Express, also known by its Spanish title, Pánico en el Transiberiano. Horror Express was an independent Spanish-British co-production between Spain's Granada Films, Britain's Benmar Productions, and by Philip Jordan's UK, US and Spanish-backed Scotia International Film Distributors. The film was directed by the Spanish director Eugenio Martin and is focused upon the transportation of a frozen, seemingly fossilised ancient creature. Once revived, the being promptly escapes captivity and wreaks havoc upon the occupants of a train travelling on the Trans-Siberian Railway from Peking to Moscow.
Are you telling me that an ape that lived 2 million years ago got onto that crate, killed the baggage man and put him in there, then locked everything up neat and tidy and got away?
Yes, I am. It's alive. It must be.
I first stumbled across this lesser-known gem on its 50th anniversary a couple of years ago, having read that it was another story inspired by the 1938 novella Who Goes There by John W. Campbell Jr. Who Goes There holds a special place in my heart, being the inspiration for Howard Hawks' 1951 film The Thing from Another World and John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982, the latter being one of my all-time favourite movies. Although this film doesn't credit that novella, the influence of Who Goes There is plain to see. A seemingly dead frozen being thaws out. The threat is revealed to be extraterrestrial in nature. The creature can telepathically absorb knowledge from its victims, and it can conceal itself in human form, causing paranoia and requiring scientists to develop a test to discover exactly who is who. Although it could consequently be criticised for plagiarism, instead Horror Express manages to successfully blend a multitude of genres in a story that never loses momentum. The film is a delightful cocktail of period drama, murder mystery, science fiction and horror, which, with a strong cast, witty dialogue and focused direction, makes it feel original even if some of its ideas are not. Horror Express stars the inimitable Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing as Professor Sir Alexander Saxton and Dr. Wells. At this stage in his career, Christopher Lee was still best known for his horror roles in the UK and Europe. Horror Express was released the year before he performed his favourite film role, Lord Summerisle in The Wicker Man, and 2 years before his memorable turn as Francisco Scaramanga from the James Bond film The Man with the Golden Gun. Whilst Lee would frequently appear in more international productions, Peter Cushing had remained committed to starring in British productions, particularly as he had devoted himself to the care of his ailing wife, Helen. Captain Kazan is played memorably by Telly Savalas at a time when he was in great demand. Savalas had recently played the role of Ernst Stavro Blofeld in the 1969 James Bond film On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and he would soon embark upon his most famous television role as Lieutenant Theo Kojak. The rest of the supporting cast is populated by mainstays of Spanish cinema, including the Argentinian actor Alberto de Mendoza as the monk Father Pujardov, Spanish actors Julio Peña and Silvia Tortosa as Inspector Mirov and Countess Irina Petrovsky, as well as the American actress Alice Reinhardt as Miss Jones. The period setting and wide variety of characters with different roles immediately strikes the tone of a murder mystery story. So it's interesting to note that Horror Express came out 2 years before the first cinematic adaptation of Murder on the Orient Express. As the movie was shot without audio, the film's dialogue was recorded separately and post-synced. Fans of classic Doctor Who will recognise the dulcet tones of Roger Delgado, who dubs the voice of Inspector Mirov. Father Pujardov's voice was dubbed by Robert Rioty, and all of the female voices were dubbed by Olive Gregg. Fortunately, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing and Telly Savalas provided their own voices for the finished film. The film's composer, John Kakavas, was a close friend of Telly Savalas, who helped give John his big break in the movie industry. Instantly bonding over their shared Greek heritage, when they first met in London, John would assist Telly with recordings for the actor's music career. At this time, Telly was playing the lead in Scotia International's 1971 film Poncho Villa, a film made by the same team who would work on Horror Express. Although he did not score Poncho Villa, Telly recommended John's services to Bernard Gordon and Eugenio Martin, and John consequently ended up writing the music for the film's title song. The finished song, We All End Up the Same, was performed by Savalas over the closing credits.
Wake up, my weary friend. There's a new world to discover.
And so, with this experience under his belt and the approval of Philip Jordan for how cheap his services were, John was hired to compose Horror Express's soundtrack. This first credit as a composer was a key moment at the start of John's extensive career in film and television, but he is probably most famous for writing the score for Kojak between 1973 and 1978, as well as the main theme for the final series. Telly Savalas and John lived in apartments opposite each other when they lived in London, the actor and composer collaborating to produce 2 of Telly's albums. The two remained close until Telly's death in 1994. By the time John was brought on board for Horror Express, filming had already been completed. The film's associate producer, Irving Lerner, who assisted Kakavas with the score, suggested that John should write a fugue for the film's climactic conclusion, and this is certainly one of the film's standout musical accompaniments. Kakavas ended up spending most of the money he had received for the film on the production's orchestra, unusually using 4 violas, 4 cellos, but no violins. A whistling motif is one of the key pieces of music which runs throughout the film.
Oh, it's the piece I was playing. I wonder who it is.
Initially, this is a non-diegetic piece of music on the soundtrack, but later it becomes diegetic, first when it is whistled by the baggage man, and thereafter the sound is mimicked by the creature. Kakavas was proud of his finished work, and rightly so. The film's screenplay is attributed to Arnaud Dussault and Julien Zimet, credited as Julien Halevi, from an original story by Eugenio Martin. The creative origins of this film are not as simple as they seem, however. Peering behind the curtain at the team who collaborated to create Horror Express reveals that a number of them had been blacklisted by Hollywood by the House Un-American Activities Committee. This blacklist of American entertainment professionals for being a member of the Communist Party, having communist sympathies, or simply refusing to cooperate with congressional investigations into the party damaged the careers of approximately 300 individuals. Among the people caught up in this hysteria was Horror Express's producer, Bernard Gordon. Allegations by the House Un-American Activities Committee alone were enough to destroy Gordon's writing career in the United States, particularly as he was a trade union activist and was a former member of the Communist Party. He found himself banned from employment by the major studios and therefore used the pseudonym Raymond T. Marcus so that he could keep working. Gordon did have the foresight to keep the same social security number, however, which proved critical in enabling him to claim credit for his work once the blacklist had been broken. Bernard lost 3 of his scriptwriting credits but had 9 of his credits returned, making him the blacklisted writer with the greatest success of having their credits rightfully attributed to them later on. Horror Express's uncredited co-producer, Philip Jordan, provided Gordon with regular work and a refuge from Hollywood's blacklist hysteria in Spain. Jordan acted as a front for blacklisted writers, although was considered by some to be a credit stealer. During this time, Gordon would lose the credit for a number of pictures, including 1963's The Day of the Triffids and 1965's Battle of the Bulge. So who actually wrote Horror Express? It has been concluded that Arnaud Dussault penned the first draft and, after several rewrites, was later replaced by Julien Zimet, who introduced many of the film's key ideas and science fiction elements. Still unimpressed with the quality of the script, however, Eugenio Martin refused to direct the film, necessitating further rewrites from Zimet and Bernard Gordon. It is surely no coincidence that the film's morally ambiguous Captain Kazan shares his name with Elia Kazan. Elia was a former member of the Communist Party who infamously named 8 actors when he testified as a friendly witness before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Bernard Gordon would later be one of many who fought to deny Kazan his 1999 honorary Oscar. It was Zemet and Gordon who were primarily responsible for Horror Express's finished screenplay. The original story credit for Martin was a concession made to ensure that the film qualified for financial and distribution benefits by having a greater degree of Spanish input in the finished product. Horror Express was appropriately enough Eugenio Martin's 13th feature film, and the first time he had delved into the horror genre. As with Pancho Villa, the film was credited to an anglicised version of his name, Gene. Horror Express was primarily shot outside Madrid at the former Estudios Madrid 70, a studio complex financed by Philip Jordan, most often referred to as the Ganzo Studios. The carriage sets were essentially a series of flats, which were mounted on springs in order to replicate the motion of the train in transit. Only 2 interior sets were available at any one time, however, and one of these was permanently dressed as the freight car. Both of these sets can be spotted in use in Pancho Villa, although in that prior film they are much barer and less decorated than they appear in Horror Express. The dressing of these sets, the production design credited to Ramiro Gomez, is first rate. The opulent looking design coupled with the lighting and cinematography of Alejandro Ulloa, enough to convince the viewer that the film has a bigger budget than it did. Filming commenced in early December 1971, where it was completed on a 30-day schedule on an approximately $350,000 budget. Additional location work for the picture was carried out at De La Silla Station for the film's peaking railway station sequences. This was an advantageous location for the film, as it eliminated the need to build and dress a large additional set, and, more significantly, it enabled the brief use of a real full-sized locomotive alongside the actors. This helps to make the rest of the film's miniature work more convincing, allowing the film to better hide its limited budget. Today, De La Silla Station is home to the Museo del Ferrocarril de Madrid, or Madrid Railway Museum, where it boasts one of Europe's largest historic rail collections. The distinctive location has also been used in further productions, including the films Dr. Zhivago from 1965 and 1971's Nicholas and Alexandra. It is perhaps because of De La Silla Station's association with the latter film that a great deal of confusion has been caused around Horror Express's most significant prop, the large electrically connected miniature train. The origins of this miniature train have been blurred by Eugenio Martin's claim that it was a prop purchased from that production. It is irrefutable, however, that the miniature train used in Horror Express is one of 2 miniature trains used in the production that immediately preceded it, Pancho Villa. According to Bernard Gordon, it had been commissioned and built for that production, which is why he wanted to make the most from the investment by producing a train-focused movie immediately afterward. And so, with Scotia International already moving away from westerns and knowing that horror made money on generally smaller budgets, the train became instrumental in the gestation of the story. As much as I thoroughly enjoy this film for its entertainment value alone, the things that make it particularly special are the behind-the-scenes stories and the bond between Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee.
Well, look who's here. Professor Saxon, I presume?
Dr. Wells.
And what are you doing in Shanghai?
I've asked you the same thing.
Following the loss of his wife Helen to emphysema in 1971, Cushing was overcome with grief and in a difficult emotional place. On the day she passed, he even attempted to take his own life by marching up and down the staircase of his home in order to induce a heart attack. Helen had left behind a letter, however, telling Peter, "Do not be hasty to leave this world. We will meet again." Peter, therefore, resolved to throw himself into his work, accepting most of the projects that came his way, regardless of quality, and was prepared to work himself to death. Arriving 1 week after the commencement of the filming for Horror Express, upon being picked up by a car driven by Bernard Gordon, Peter Cushing immediately informed him that he had no intention of being involved in the production and had only made the trip to inform him of this decision in person. This was the first time that Peter had travelled outside of the UK since Helen's passing, and though he had initially thought himself able to play the role, the melancholy had grown too much for him. Bernard Gordon turned to Christopher Lee to remedy the situation, Lee famously sitting with Cushing and delivering a half-hour monologue to put his friend at ease. Upon finishing, Lee bid his farewells and told Peter he would see him on set in the morning, which is exactly what happened. Devoted to his friend, it has been said that Christopher Lee would sleep in the same bed as Cushing so that he could keep a close eye on him, as, in his grief, Peter was also suffering from night terrors. One method Lee would use to distract him was by playing with the film's miniature train in their downtime. Ever the gentleman, Peter would apologise to Gordon for his actions a week into the production, complimenting him on the script and the working environment. His experience working on Horror Express was certainly more positive than other films he had worked on whilst he was grieving. Director Freddie Francis reduced Peter to tears when he forced him to do multiple retakes of a scene where he is reminiscing about his late wife in 1975's The Ghoul. Beyond taking care of Cushing, Christopher Lee's experience with Horror Express was much more straightforward. Lee enjoyed his role and approved of the script, particularly as this time he was playing the lead romantic hero. It is surprising that neither Lee nor Cushing cost a huge amount of money to hire for the film. Nevertheless, Eugenio Martin had nothing but overwhelming praise for the two British actors, describing them as complete professionals, never late to the set, never forgetting their lines, and a pleasure to work with. Cushing was a teetotaler and a strict vegetarian. A famous story of Lee's is that whilst on the set of Horror Express, Christopher had complained to Peter about the quality of the food. Cushing, peeling an apple, simply responded, "Well, there's no good bellyaching about it, you know," a response which left Lee in shock. They were the most severe words that Cushing had ever spoken to him. There are no better words to describe Peter Cushing than those of his friend Christopher Lee, who, on his passing, said, "He really was the greatest and most generous of men. It could be said of him that he died because he was too good for this world." Horror Express opens with its impressive train miniature travelling at speed, which could easily pass for a real locomotive, although the shot is then sadly followed by a second which clearly shows the silhouettes of the camera crew and ends with the camera seemingly being jolted by accident. As soon as the opening titles roll and John Kakavas' score strikes up, however, the film rapidly goes from strength to strength, although with that being said, the opening credits do manage to misspell Christopher Lee, dropping the first H. After the opening credits, we receive some brief narration by Lee, indicating that the events of the movie are a retelling of those that have already occurred. We are soon introduced to Christopher Lee's character, anthropologist Professor Sir Alexander Saxton, and at the station soon after, Dr. Wells, travelling with his assistant, the bacteriologist Miss Jones. Cushing's Wells immediately comes across as affable, if somewhat condescending towards Saxton, introducing the Professor to Miss Jones as someone who dabbles in fossils and bones. Wells is clearly more worldly wise than Saxton, bribing the station master in order to obtain his rail tickets, whereas Saxton has to end up resorting to violence. For the bulk of their shared careers, Lee and Cushing were cast in dramatic opposition to each other, most famously with Van Helsing against Dracula and Dr. Frankenstein with his monster. The film wastes no time establishing the story's key players. The discovery of the first victim at the station in broad daylight, serving to introduce Inspector Mirov and the priest Pujardov. With Pujardov, it is particularly amusing that in the space of a single train journey, a devout holy man warning against evil progresses to worshipping what he perceives to be Satan. The conflict that exists between the film's religious and scientific characters, particularly when the theory of evolution is involved, further adds to the film's character.
Beast is not dead. I put 4 bullets into him.
You think evil can be killed with bullets? Satan lives.
In Horror Express, it could easily be argued that the on-train murders are expedited by Dr. Wells's curiosity, who once again uses bribery to encourage the baggage man to peek inside Saxton's locked crate, an action which claims the baggage man's life. Clearly, the two characters they portray here share a prickly history, but as the film progresses, the warmth between the two is clear to see. Thankfully, Horror Express sees Wells and Saxton rapidly become allies to combat the threat on board, their national and scientific bond driving them to overcome their past rivalry and solve the problem at hand. Cushing and Lee worked on 22 films together over 35 years, sharing the screen on 20 of these productions, but it is Horror Express where they share the most screen time. Theirs was a long, professional and personal relationship, so it is almost impossible not to view their performances in Horror Express as a reflection of their real-life friendship. It is a real treat to see them both playing the hero, rather than in their typical adversarial roles from their Hammer Films outings. Both characters even have their own brief romantic scenes in the picture, Saxton with the Countess and Wells with the Russian spy Natasha, played by Helga Linné, which does lead to a wonderful comedic moment with Miss Jones.
Miss Jones, I shall need your assistance.
Yes, well, at your age, I'm not surprised.
With an autopsy.
Oh, well, that's different.
Horror Express is reminiscent of earlier Hammer horror films, even though Gordon and Martin tried to distance themselves from this comparison, claiming in the press that neither had seen a Hammer film before embarking on the project. By this time, Hammer's productions were going through changes, its budgets shrinking and greater amounts of nudity being included, the studio trying to push British censors with increasingly explicit sexual content. Hammer's distinctive horror flavour was already having an influence on contemporary horror cinema, so it is perhaps no surprise that Horror Express feels like an homage to Hammer. Of course, this is also an unavoidable comparison when two Hammer stalwarts are so prominently in front of the camera throughout. The early 1970s proved to be a period of significant change for the horror genre, with its films moving away from the monster movies of its past, but with the slasher subgenre not yet cemented. Horror Express can be seen as a proto-slasher movie in parts, mixed with science fiction horror, Lovecraftian cosmic horror, and at one stage it even becomes a zombie movie. Horror Express clearly has a harder edge than some of its forebears. Dr. Wells's autopsies, although lacking in medical accuracy, provide the film with a good opportunity to showcase its gorier effects. Although the film is quite restrained by horror film standards, the scene where Wells uses a bone saw to expose the drained brain of one of the victims in what is described as a trepan but is really a craniotomy is nevertheless effective. It is no coincidence that the film is reminiscent of other films, such as Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the writers unashamed to crib ideas from other productions. However, mixing science fiction with a period-based atmospheric gothic horror aesthetic and interlacing that with comedic moments gives the film an undeniable charm. Certainly, no review of Horror Express would be complete without what is hands down the best, most memorable exchange of the movie.
Two of you together, that's fine. But what if one of you is the monster?
Monster? They're British, you know.
Eugenio Martin considered the story to be more of an adventure than science fiction or horror, and it is that approach which lends the film so much energy, making Horror Express more than just a creature feature. The initial impression of the film's antagonist is that the threat that the train occupants are facing is an ancient evil. Once the creature has thawed and reanimated, the eyes are soon revealed to be its primary method of attack and defence. It is interesting that the creature is on the back foot, as its right eye has seemingly deteriorated in the ice. This forces the creature to navigate the carriages and attack its victims as stealthily as possible, which adds to the horror, particularly in the eerie scene where it enters a carriage occupied by two sleeping children. When it transpires that the monster is in fact extraterrestrial in nature and was using the frozen body of the primitive humanoid as a host, it only serves to make the film more noteworthy. Although I'm always a big fan of mysteries in film, it doesn't spoil the enjoyment that we soon know the identity of the creature's host. Instead, we are treated to a cat and mouse game as Saxton and Wells scientifically uncover the monster's origins and its ability to move between hosts, the pair attempting to devise a test to reveal it, which in turn makes them the creature's main target. Evidence for Saxton's theory that the creature is of alien origin is established through the use of forensic optography, a technique which has long been debunked as pseudoscience. Although the use of this technique can seem fanciful when it is used in films like Dario Argento's Four Flies on Grey Velvet, here and in other science fiction works, such as the Doctor Who story The Ark in Space from 1975, it feels much more appropriate. Well, perhaps the images of a brontosaurus and pterodactyl, which are clearly just illustrations, are a little difficult to overlook, but given the film's budget, they're an understandable compromise for the sake of the story. The grisly state in which the creature leaves behind its victims is particularly memorable. the corpses left with their eyes boiled white and leaking blood. To achieve this effect, white plastic covers were fitted beneath the actors' eyelids. The fact that the creature isn't simply slaying its victims, instead acting as a kind of intelligence vampire, serves to make it more interesting as an antagonist. It is driven by purpose rather than bloodlust, trying to establish from the passengers if this time period is advanced enough to allow it to escape the planet and return to its galaxy. As soon as Telly Savalas and his Cossacks enter the train, around 2/3 into the film, Horror Express is given a large shot of adrenaline. Although essentially a guest star, Telly is extremely entertaining and over the top with his performance here.
The Tsar will hear of this. I'll have you sent to Siberia.
I am in Siberia.
Undoubtedly, he ad-libbed most of his lines. According to Eugenio Martin, every rehearsal with Telly was different, a distinct contrast to the classically trained acting of Peter and Christopher, and it makes their brief scenes a pleasure to watch.
Now anything that moves near that door, kill it! But what if the monk is innocent? We got lots of innocent monks.
Even when the film is drawing to a close, it deftly throws in a final twist when zombie Cossacks, victims of the creature, rise from the grave. The blank white eye effect even more effective when it is displayed by the reanimated corpses attacking the film's protagonists. It is unfortunate then when the film does end so abruptly. In an interesting last-minute development, Moscow telegrams ahead to stop the express at a switching point, the government callously attempting to save the day by killing all on board. Hearing the signalmen musing that they might be at war broadens the scope of the film, as they don't realise that the war they are talking about is in fact an interstellar one.
Maybe there's a war. Maybe it's war.
The climactic train crash was achieved by the use of a 40-foot tower on the Daganzo set. The miniatures were shot against a matte background using 4 cameras, one of which was capable of shooting at 4 times normal speed. Contrary to appearances, the high-quality train model was not wrecked in order to achieve this sequence, a wooden replica being substituted for the film's explosive finale. There is little ambiguity in the film's ending. The evil of the story is simply considered to be vanquished, in spite of the fact that the very nature of the threat should require the protagonist to question whether all of those who have survived are indeed who they appear to be. In my view, this is why the ambiguous conclusion of John Carpenter's The Thing is so effective. As the credits for Horror Express roll, we are treated once more to the fantastic soundtrack by John Kakavas. Horror Express was well reviewed when it was released in the UK, but sadly less so in Martin's native Spain. Its reception in the United States was also damaged because of the quality of the film prints which were shown in cinemas. Due to the collapse of a financial deal which was secured against the film negative of Horror Express, the negative had been seized from the laboratory in Madrid by 2 of the loan's signatories. Panicking that no film was going to be released, Ben Fiss, Philip Jordan's business partner at Scotia International, sold the US distribution rights for a mere $100,000. However, without the original negative, the reels that were shipped to theatres ended up being poor quality prints that had been produced from the film's work print. On top of this, the film's advertising was poor, Scotia International even failing to print the names of the film stars on its poster. It is unfortunate that the film never had the chance to become a hit upon its release, primarily because theatres didn't choose to book it. So it is really positive that Horror Express has a strong cult following and remains appreciated all of these years later. Due to failures on the part of the distributor, Horror Express is another classic film which fell into the public domain, but this has only proved to be beneficial to the film's cult status. Although you can watch various transfers of the film online for free, I wholeheartedly recommend picking up the Arrow Video Blu-ray release from 2018. That 2K restoration, in its original aspect ratio, was produced from the original 35mm camera negative, with the exception of one lost reel, and its mono sound mix was remastered from the original mag reels. In my view, it is the best the film has ever looked or sounded. Although I would rate this film as an 8 out of 10, don't let that dissuade you from experiencing it for yourself. In my view, Horror Express is pure entertainment, a combination of winning elements that make for an energetic thrill ride across the Siberian tundra of pre-revolutionary Russia. I have to recommend John Connolly's Monster, We're British You Know, the Horror Express book from the Midnight Movie Monograph series, published by Electric Dreamhouse. A mine of fascinating information on the movie, it also ended up being a very emotional read, and, in my view, it is a must-buy for fans of the film. On a similar note, I also picked up the Horror Express novelisation, or should I say adaptation in novel form, by David O'Hanlon. Although I certainly did enjoy this adaptation, the decision to transplant the story to Canada whilst retaining most of the names of the original characters felt like an unnecessary decision, and it is a version of the story with much more explicit violence and language than the film which inspired it. For me though, it ended up highlighting just how effective the 1972 film remains. A classy film from a time where major stars could demonstrate their talents in low-budget pictures. On paper, Horror Express was a film designed to generate a quick profit, drawing in English-speaking cinemagoers with its choice of stars. In spite of this, the amount of effort put into this production is obvious to see, the film expertly concealing its modest budget with an adventurous and witty script lent life and charm by a veteran cast. The level of craftsmanship achieved by the team at Daganzo Studios and the inventive way that they utilised their limited resources and small number of sets is nothing short of remarkable. It is proof positive that the creativity and inventiveness of low to mid-budget horror should never be overlooked.
Run. Run for your life. Hide, but you can't escape. No one can stop the fury and the terror of the Horror Express.
Hopefully you enjoyed this 7th episode of Sitting Through the Credits. I'm looking forward to bringing more film reviews to you in the near future. Thanks for listening.
I'm gonna hide this tape when I'm finished.
Replicants are like any other machine. They're either a benefit or a hazard.
Erasing it. It's life.
What's the boogeyman?
Any further resistance will be dealt with in the same way.
As a matter of fact, it was.
End of story.